Welcome to the Alex Salmond Show from Aberdeenshire in Scotland, and to an examination of the economics of the COVID crisis. The world economy is heading towards recession, that much is certain. But could this develop into a prolonged depression, and could such an economic cataclysm end up causing more human misery than even the pandemic itself? In this show, we first look at the economic impact of the great pandemics through history. And then we ask leading international economists whether the world economy can avoid the descent into economic depression. But first, over to Tasmina with your tweets, your emails and your messages.
There has been a huge response to last week's programme on the Declaration of Arbroath, with the record views on Facebook alone of over 700,000. Seems appropriate, given the 700-year anniversary. Now, Roger Knight points out that it should be termed the Declaration of Scottish Independence. He says, correction is necessary about the document signed at Arbroath in 1320. Until the 1960s, I, as an Arbroathian, was taught that it was a Declaration of Scottish Independence. Well, Robert, it's only relatively recently that the Arbroath letter was termed a declaration at all, once declarations of independence became common in the modern world. Scotland just got there a bit quicker than the rest. But however it's termed, it's a hugely significant document for Scotland and the world. Mary White and Anne Moffat bemoan the lack of national celebrations for the 700th anniversary. Mary says, why haven't the concepts and ideals in the Declaration ever been adopted into law by Holyrood? I'm also shocked that there were no commemorative events brought forward by Holyrood to celebrate this anniversary. Anne says, gutted not much celebration of this important anniversary. It should be said, however, that there were a range of local events planned with some support, but the public response to the programmes and films that have been made indicate that something more national and international is called for next year for the 701st anniversary. Sue Parsons says, brilliant show. Thank you for celebrating the Declaration of Arbroath and its role in establishing the democratic rights of humankind. Scotia says, what a brilliant show given the circumstances. Thank you so much. Such brilliant, interesting guests as well. Louise says, nice to see the decentralisation of television studios too. Louise, of course, is referring to Alex filming from Stricken. Patricia says, very interesting. Back in the folk singing days in Edinburgh at least, and the dislike of Polaris being dumped in Scotland without our permission, was the start of a new awakening in Scotland that has grown since. Vivian says, a blast from the past in more ways than one. Ted Cowan was my first Scottish history tutor at Edinburgh University many moons ago. He spoke about myths and realities of history, and I remember it to this day. Pilar says, excellent show. Great to see and listen to Billy Kate, learning a lot about Scottish history. Lynn says, what a great show, Alex. I was so disappointed that the March in Arbroath was cancelled. Your show really cheered me up.
In early February, we asked the author of Pandemic Century, Dr. Mark Honigsbaum, as to his view of the coming fury. This is what he had to say then.
There is something odd about this virus, the way it seems to be a very subtle virus, a very wily virus. If you think about a good strategy for a virus to spread worldwide, is actually not to make many people sick, right? In Darwinian terms, a virus will succeed if it gets through all our controls, and the best way it can do that is to spread under the radar by not causing overt illness. So that's what it's doing.
And today he joins me from West London. Dr. Honigsbaum, you've studied pandemics through history. I'm interested in particular in this show about the economic impact of the great pandemics through history. Do they have something to teach us about the likely economic consequences of this medical and human disaster?
Well, yes. I mean, so if you look to, the Spanish influenza pandemic that occurred just a little over 100 years ago, quite uncanny, the historical timings. That occurred during World War. So, of course, it was a completely different economic and geopolitical situation. Nonetheless, we know that the economic impacts of the pandemic were profound. It depressed GDP substantially, not just in the UK and Europe, but in the United States and North America. But interestingly, because the pandemic, and this is true, I'm afraid, of all pandemics, they tend to take out not just fit people, but they tend to sort of remove the unhealthiest and the least able members of the population. What that means afterwards is there's a kind of bounce back in terms of the people who are left, tend to be more healthy and robust. So what you kind of lose economically, you make up for in savings on health costs later.
So could that be said that this rather callous interpretation that some of the less productive people will be removed, could that really have been behind the government tinkering with, or at least contemplating, the so-called herd immunity strategy? Is it really in government people who think quite as callously as that, or is it much more a case of just lack of clear thinking and charting a way forward?
I think it's more a case of the government realizing, well, I think, first of all, they didn't really have a plan. I think that's the first thing that's become clear. The second thing is, although we were told repeatedly by Boris Johnson that he was following the science, this famous quote, what we now know is the science, there was conflicting scientific opinion, and he chose to listen to one scientific advisors, who I think there is evidence were swayed by the idea. The mistake they really made, and this is important to understand, Alex, is all the modeling that had been done up to now was based on an influenza pandemic. Okay, that was the template for their response. And influenza, we know, is very high. It's very difficult to stop it spreading. Once you know it's a threat, it's probably already here. That was not true of coronavirus. Coronavirus is a different virus. It spreads differently. And there was an opportunity, which we missed, to stop it much more vigorously, not only at the borders, but after it got in, we could have imposed much more testing and chased down those contacts and the contacts of the contacts. If we'd done that, I think we would have seen much lower rates of infections and hospitalizations, perhaps more on the German model. So that wasn't done. So that left us with little choice but to sort of muddle along. And I think it's quite possible that they flirted with this herd immunity. I think we're still flirting with it. I think we've got a de facto herd immunity strategy, because if I step outside my front door in London, I can still see lots of people walking too close to one another, joggers in particular running right up close to people, ignoring whether they're elderly or not. That is a de facto herd immunity strategy.
And finally, Dr. Honigsbaum, will anything ever be the same again?
Well, listen, this is a really tough conversation that I'm having with my daughter now. I think it's very, very challenging. And I think this is a big difference with 1918. So the 1918 pandemic is widely known by historians as the forgotten pandemic, because although many millions of people died worldwide, it didn't have the sort of profound impacts that we think this pandemic is and is already having. I think it will, simply because it's going to cause such a major economic depression. For that fact alone, I think it will be well remembered.
Dr. Honigsbaum from West London, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, Alex.
So what are the economic impact of this pandemic? First to Europe, where I turn to Europe's smallest country, and Dr. Stephanie Fabri of the University of Malta. Dr. Fabri, Malta has been praised by the World Health Organization for its efforts to contain the pandemic. Are these efforts succeeding, and is that situation likely to continue?
I'm very proud to say that the World Health Organization has praised Malta, and that Malta, up till now, and can be seen as a best practice case study in terms of managing this pandemic. Our health system has always been and still is impeccable, and we have an extremely talented health staff. The priority at the moment is the health of the society. So the priority is flattening the curve as much as possible. So we need to think long term. If we manage to flatten the curve, in the long term, we will be able to re-establish our economy in a more efficient way, faster. So if we think long term, I think there is a win-win situation between the economy and social well-being.
Dr. Fabri, you and other Maltese economists this week have published a major report called Agile, which looks forward to the best policy prescriptions to take Malta, and indeed elsewhere in Europe, out of the COVID crisis. What was your aim behind the publication of that report, and what are its major recommendations?
Well, over the past 2 weeks, together with a team of young economists, we've been working really hard to review the local context. We have interviewed various stakeholders, social partners, business leaders, and we also did a consumer survey to take stock of the current situation. For the present situation, we are saying that there should be we should address 4 areas: the fiscal, the legal, the administrative, and the monetary. The fiscal, we are proposing additional measures such as tax credits to companies who do not lay off workers, and additional government revenue from, for example, landfill tax to cover for these incentives, tax on single-use plastics, additional taxes on plastic packaging, sweetened products, and so on. With regards to the legal measures, we are saying that certain aspects of the law should be covered to cater for the current situation, like, for example, the Employment Law, the Companies Act with respect to liquidation and insolvency, and the Financial Crime Review. Then we are proposing for the current situation administrative measures. We are saying that the government maybe can be more efficient by redeploying human resources from departments that are not so busy at the moment to other departments that are very busy with respect to implementing the incentives put forward by government. Finally, we are saying that there are aspects of monetary policy which we should also look at. Now, you might tell me monetary policy in Malta is in the hands of the ECB, but the Malta Development Bank plays an important role in this. And we are saying that there could be schemes that promote the green economy, digitalization, and promoting startups as well. Then we have a set of measures post-COVID. For immediately post-COVID, we are saying that there should be discussions ongoing as from now to establish a recovery plan for when the economic engine restarts. The discussions should take place between the main stakeholders and also government.
Dr. Fabri, thinking from the perspective of Europe's smallest country to now continent-wide, do you think the European Central Bank are promising the sort of scale of economic bazookas which will meet to the scale of this crisis?
Yes, so up till now, the crisis affected the different countries in the EU in a different way, and it hit us abruptly. So the individual countries had no option but basically to implement their individual incentives. When you take stock of these incentives, they are more or less coherent. So they target funds to civil protection, to healthcare, and to address liquidity issues. In the meantime, the European Central Bank was asking for recommendations from the individual countries to offer a holistic plan. And the 500 billion package was launched last week. Could have there been more incentives? When looking at countries like Italy, I think there could have been more incentives with regards to solidarity. Could we have done more? Maybe yes. However, when you consider the fact that the EU is made up of different countries with different economic visions in a way, different characteristics, aims, etc., I think that it takes longer to come with a holistic plan, to identify a holistic plan altogether. However, I believe that a more proactive and efficient response is required from the EU in general. At the moment, we are proposing to companies to revamp or readjust their contingency planning just in case something like this will happen. And I think at an EU level, we need to do the same. We need to readjust our contingency planning so that, God forbid, another crisis happens, maybe not to this extent, we will be much more ready to adjust accordingly.
Dr. Stephanie Fabri from Malta, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much, Alex. Thank you.
Join us after the break, where I'll speak to Professor David Blanchflower of Dartmouth College of the likely policy response of both the Federal Reserve and the Bank of England. Will it meet the scale of the crisis? Join us then. Professor David Blanchflower is a former member of the Monetary Policy Committee of the Bank of England and has been a leading and trenchant critic of the weakness of policy response to the Great Recession of 10 years ago. How does he assess the likely policy response on both sides of the Atlantic to the current COVID crisis? Is it going to meet the scale of the emergency? Danny Blanchflower joins me from Florida. Professor David Blanchflower, you've been a trenchant critic of the weakness of policy response over the last 10 years to the Great Recession and argued that that's prolonged unemployment and underemployment at high levels. What's your assessment thus far of the policy response in the United States and the United Kingdom to the great pandemic?
Well, I think the only word I can use is exemplary, in the sense that they absolutely got it. And so I guess I would say that in 2008, eventually, policymakers too slowly threw the kitchen sink at it. What we've seen in the last month is policymakers threw the kitchen at it. So they've reacted very quickly. I mean, in the UK, there's several tranches. That's going on in the US as well. But I think, go back to the original part of your question, I don't think the economies were in very good shape to take the shock that was coming. And that was because of very bad policy, austerity policy that you talked about and you and I both opposed for a very long time. And just think, in the United Kingdom, real wages at the start of this pandemic in March 2020 were 3% lower than they were in 2008. So yes, we have seen a fantastically rapid, enormous response, but the economies themselves were much weaker than they should have been if policy had been appropriate post 2008. So yes, they learned their lesson this time, and I was teaching my classes yesterday about how appalling it was in 2008. So they've learned that lesson, but times are looking pretty tough, and I certainly think the United States looks like the unemployment rate already is about 20%. Maybe that's close to it in Canada as well. So this is very, very sharp, tough time, but they have done well, conditional on the fact that for 20 years they did terribly.
Now, the numbers that are coming forward from the Treasury and the Bank of England in the UK and from the Fed and from the federal government in the United States look pretty impressive. But is there a danger of the best laid schemes of mice and men gang after gley? Because already we see sharply rising unemployment in the United States, and we see small businesses in the United Kingdom say they can't see where the money is because it's not reached them.
Well, I think that, Alex, I think that's part of it. I mean, in a sense, the scale of the problem, the starting point was weak, and the speed that this thing has come with has meant that the scale of the response is unprecedented. But I think the way you asked the question, unprecedented, but not enough. So there's an awful picture we've seen in San Antonio, Texas, where a food bank in Texas opened a couple of days ago, and there were 10,000 cars lined up. There's a huge parking. It looked like a dealership, and then a 4-mile line of cars trying to get food. People, the money hasn't come, despite the fact that we say the government has responded. People haven't got the money to get food. I mean, there's a series of surveys going out now around the world asking people if you lost your job today and you lost your income, which many have, how long could you last with the money that you've got? The answer is about 2 weeks. 40% of the people say a couple of weeks or so. So now what's happened is, okay, this money's coming. In the US, the IRS started to put money out yesterday, but many people probably won't get any money until the fall. Well, there's the problem. Yeah, the response is high, but where's the money? How am I going to pay the bill? How am I going to pay my rent? How am I going to pay for the food? So I think these are two issues we're going to see, Alex. How are people going to pay their rent? And how are they going to get food? And you rightly say, how are these small businesses going to survive? I mean, estimates in the United States are, despite all of this, and this may be too much, but the estimates I have seen suggest that perhaps half the restaurants in the United States, because of all this, these mostly small businesses, are basically going to close.
So is it possible that despite the unimaginable human misery being caused by COVID-19, that the human misery caused by a prolonged depression would be even greater.
Well, that could be so, Alex. I mean, I think that there's a policy response that we can look at, and obviously there's the likelihood is there may well be long-term damage done. I think the answer, though, is then there's this pressure in various countries, in Austria and in the US, we're seeing every day. There's pressure to open. There's pressure to open the economies because you say, as you rightly just suggested, the danger from what's happened to the economy is so substantial. But the danger of opening too soon and spreading the virus and killing more people is greater. I think perhaps we should go back to the original way you set this up. In 2008, the world was unprepared for a financial crisis. In 2020, they were unprepared for basically a health crisis. And so now we're playing catch up. And all the responses that we've seen, which I said were exemplary, but they're not going to be enough. They're probably going to have to do the same thing next month and the month afterwards. And so the things that we're seeing are unthinkable is that over this decade or so, the world and policymakers have been utterly unprepared. They haven't had stocks of masks and gowns. And in 2008, they weren't aware that banks were going to fail. And I remember talking to you when you were the first minister, we talked a bit about, well, where are the shovel-ready projects? If you need to do something, where are they? What's the list of things that you've got? And so the answer was, this is a history of unpreparedness. And there's huge implications of banks failing on people. And now there's huge implications on the economy of a health crisis that the policymakers were unprepared for. And what's the other thing we should talk about, Alex, in a way, is that there's going to be distributional consequences. Who are the ones who lose the most? And the answer is the young, the least educated, the ones with the lowest incomes. And the ones that hurt last time are the same ones that are going to be hurt this time. And the boom didn't help them that much.
So if there is a sustained economic response to the scale of this human crisis, can we avoid too much damage to the fabric and growth of the world economy?
Well, hopefully. I mean, obviously, you're trying to buy time to isolate this virus. You're trying to have stay-at-home orders to protect it in time to get a vaccine. The reality of free market economics, the first time you realize you have to give up your plan is from the Mike Tyson quote, is when you get punched in the face. So you've been punched in the face and you need to respond, and you may need to respond for a long time. And the question is, will the policymakers understand that you got to keep going? Because they didn't understand it in 2010.
And Professor Blanchflower, out of this enormous human misery on a planetary scale, and out of this economic crisis on a global scale, is it possible that with the right policy prescriptions that the economy which emerges would have some beneficial aspects to it?
Pretty tough to be really positive right now, but I think there are going to be long-term adjustments. But the problem is we need to have a plan for the post-pandemic, and we don't know what that is. It's going to hit us very hard. So I think the answer is that, yeah, fundamental changes may come, but we don't have a plan. We've been punched in the face, and it's going to be hard to work out exactly what that is. I suspect there will be long-term fundamental change to the economy, and we're going to have resources ready for potentially the next pandemic to hit us.
And if you had a guiding light for policymakers across the planet, Danny, what would that be right now? If you had a message to policymakers internationally, what would it be now to meet the scale of this crisis?
You know that you and I have talked over the years. I guess I like the great soccer analogy, right? Get your retaliation in first. Get ready to. The only issue right now is to do too little. I mean, I just think, as I said to you, throw the kitchen sink at this thing. Let's get in there and do everything, because the scale of this shock is so immense. Because remember, I think the other thing is that I look back, I remember Gordon Brown once told me, he wrote this great book, he told me this, he said, we had always simulated what would happen if a single bank failed. So each of the countries had thought about, what if RBS failed? What if the Bank of America failed? And he said, the mistake we made was not to think about what happened when the global banking system failed. And I think the big thing here is that people seem to be thinking too much on a single country level. You asked me a question about Germany, but Germany has to remember that Austria and Sweden and New Zealand and Australia and India and so this is a global crisis. And I think that the only thing I would say to people is the only issue I think you're going to do is to not do enough. It's really hard to think that doing too much would be a fix to this. Get money to the people, as fast as you can, and keep bringing it to them, and then eventually we can get back to the reality again. And the logic would be, supposing Scotland was invaded by the Vikings or something or other, what would you do? You wouldn't say, well, we can't do a thing because it's going to take a while to get the parliament together, and think of it as being on a war setting. Get ready, go. It's not on your marks, get set. It's like red light, green light, go. So that's what I would say to people. Go.
Professor David Blanchflower in Florida, thank you very much indeed.
Of course.
For much of the 20th century, the great economic debate was between the adherents of two towering economists, John Maynard Keynes and Milton Friedman. Their adherents continued a struggle for policy domination, at least in the liberal democracies, for most of certainly the second half of the 20th century. Now, it's a little known fact that these two great economists actually agreed on one thing. They agreed that there could be an economic event so cataclysmic that it justified an economic and particularly a monetary policy response from government way outside the normal parameters. The COVID crisis is such an event, and it's on the level of response from governments is going to determine the economic future. Basically, unless governments are prepared to open up the printing presses and act beyond their experience, their previous experience, then recession will indeed turn into depression. And it's going to be on the scale of that response and its coordination worldwide that will make the difference between recession and depression, and will make the difference between prolonged economic misery to add to the human misery that the world is already experiencing. And so from Tasmina, myself, and all at the show, it's goodbye for now, and we'll see you next week.